Right, so today we're going to do balancing equations, and for the grade 10s you already did this in grade 9, so I'm just going to do some revision with you. Okay, now the reason why we balance equations is to just show that atoms and mass is conserved during a chemical reaction, which means when you do a chemical reaction, if you started with a certain amount of oxygens, at the end of the reaction you must end up with the same amount of oxygens. So it means everything on the left hand side of the equation, which is the reactants, must be equal to everything on the right hand side of the equation, which is the products. So before and after must be the same number, and that's how you show that the atoms are conserved or it stays the same, and we have to do that by balancing equations. Now, before we start balancing equations, let's go to the rules of balancing equations. Now, the first rule is you cannot change subscripts. Now, subscripts, if you didn't know what it is the small numbers at the bottom of an element or even a compound. Okay, now if you're looking at H2O, can you see the small number that you have here? This 2, small number 2, which tells you that there's 2 hydrogens. This is a subscript. Okay, if you're looking at O2, oxygen is diatomic, so you will have 2 oxygens. Now that 2 means that there's 2 oxygens, and this here is the subscript. If you're looking at CO2, the 2 after oxygen will tell you there's 2 oxygens. This is the subscript. If you're looking at Al2O3, 2 is the subscript for telling you that there's 2 aluminiums, and 3 is the subscript for showing you that there's 3 oxygens. So subscripts is those small numbers at the bottom of an element, and when you balance equations you cannot ever change subscripts. It can never change. If you change a subscript, you're actually changing the compound, and you just cannot do that when you are balancing equations. Right, now when you're balancing equations, the only thing that you can do, and I say the only thing you can do, is change coefficients. Now what is coefficients? Coefficients are the big numbers that you get before the compound. Now it's different to subscripts. Subscripts are the small numbers, coefficients are the big numbers. Subscripts come after the element, and coefficients come before the compound. So can you see, if you have a chemical equation and you have a big number 2 in front of an compound, it means that this is the coefficient, and this is what you can change. Same if, like, for example, if you have 6 carbon dioxide, it means this is the coefficient, and you can change this in balancing an equation. Same here, this big 5 in front of ammonia, this is the coefficient. So coefficients is the only thing you can change when balancing equations. You can never even touch the subscripts. And another thing is, when it comes to coefficients, whatever number you have in front of this compound, it applies to the entire compound. So if I have a 2 in front of water, it means there is 2 times the amount of hydrogens here and 2 times the amount of oxygen. And because I have the small 2 subscript for hydrogen, it means to get the total number of hydrogens, I have to multiply these 2 numbers. So for hydrogen, I'll have 2 times 2, which is 4. And then for oxygen, if there's nothing written here, it means it's a 1. So I'll have 2 times 1, which is 2 oxygens. Same here. This 6 that you put in front of the compound, it applies to the entire compound. So this 6 goes to the carbon, and it goes to the oxygen. It's almost like maths. It's like putting a common factor in front of something. So this 6 tells you there's 6 carbons, and this 6 goes to the oxygen also, and because oxygen already has a 2 subscript, it means you're going to multiply this 2, so it's going to become 6 times 2, which will give you 12 oxygens. Same thing here with ammonia. This 5 goes to the entire ammonia, so it means you're going to have 5 nitrogens, and hydrogen, you already have 3, so you're going to multiply these 2 numbers, so you're going to have 5 times 3, which is 15 hydrogens altogether. Right, so the next rule with balancing equations is you will start with other elements first, which means any element that you have in the periodic table, you're going to start with that first, but you are going to leave oxygen and hydrogen for last, which means if you have a magnesium or a phosphorus or a zinc, you're going to start with that. Oxygen and hydrogen, you always leave it for last. Now, sometimes equations are not as straightforward, and you can't just balance them at one step, so you will have to have trial and error, which means you are going to try some numbers and then they might change during the equation until you get some that add up to each other. But it doesn't matter how many trial and errors you're going to have, At the end, when you are finished balancing your equation, whatever number of atoms you have on the left hand side, which is with your reactants, must be equal to the atoms on the right hand side, which is the products. And if they both equal to each other, then you know you have done it correctly.